Rust? Well, we heard rust never sleeps. What are rusts? They're caused by fungal pathogens. I've already said that. Okay, so they belong to the fungi. They are one of the most harmful pathogens in agriculture and in horticulture. So yes, we are very focused on the rust pathogens of cereals, but there are also rust pathogens that infect many other crops, in not only in agriculture, but also in horticulture and forestry. What characterises rust? Well, they've always been known as rust because they look rusty. They look like the rust that you see on metal. They produce these rusty coloured spores, and that image here just shows some of those spores, the Uridinea spores of leaf rust, magnified, just showing the rusty colour that they have. And they pose a particularly high biosecurity threat. And there are a number of reasons for this. One of them is that they produce masses and masses of spores, and those spores can be blown around on the wind over long distances, thousands of kilometres. So these pathogens have the ability to spread very quickly across large distances, not only through wind, but also on people's clothing. So this is a picture of a cuff of someone's trousers covered in rust spores. And those rust spores remain viable, they remain living under ambient conditions, under normal conditions for up to 2 weeks. So we're going to go to Kumultar on Saturday, I believe. We'll be walking through the paddocks, looking at stripe rust on wheat. If you don't wash your clothes and you go home and you wear your trousers or your shoes, if they've got spores on them, you could be spreading that rust up to 2 weeks from next Saturday in your own country. So it's very important to wash your clothing to make sure you get rid of any spores from your clothes. And we do know cases where these pathogens have been spread internationally on contaminated clothing. The other thing that makes them very high biosecurity threat is that they have these explosive epidemics. So Zach mentioned before them polycyclic. And what you see in a susceptible variety is an exponential increase in the pathogen during the season due to this polycyclic nature. They cycle very quickly from infection to spore production, and they have explosive epidemics. So it's those two features particularly, their ability to spread over large distances quickly and their ability to cause explosive epidemics that makes them a particularly high biosecurity threat. One of the other very interesting things about these pathogens is that they are obligate biotrophs. I'm not sure if you've heard that term before, but broadly speaking, with pathogens of plants, we put them into one of two groups. I mean, this is an oversimplification, but generally speaking, we call them either necrotrophs, which means that they infect and kill their host and then feed off the dead tissue, or they infect the host and keep the host alive and feed off that living tissue. And that's what the rusts do. They only can survive and reproduce on a living host. And this is why they're called biotrophs. They're called obligate biotrophs because we can't grow them in artificial culture very easily, all right? So a lot of fungi, we can subculture them, we can grow them on Petri dishes with agar. The rusts, we can't do this very easily at all. And at one point, they thought that that would be impossible to actually grow them on an artificial medium. But they actually succeeded, but they grow incredibly slowly. And the medium that you need to grow them on is very complex. So we still consider them to be essentially obligate biotrophs. Many are highly host specific. So we see some of these pathogens that will only infect one or a handful of host species. They've evolved very specific parasitic relationships with their host. Some rust pathogens actually alter the growth of their host. So here's a picture of a rust on acacia, a wattle tree in Australia, that is infected systemically along a branch and produced a huge gall. So many people see this, they think it's an insect gall, but in fact it's a gall created by a rust. Here's another one that's really, really interesting. This article was published in Nature quite a few years ago, but it was a study by an American lady who found that there is a rust species that infects a plant called Arabis. This is the healthy plant. This is what it normally looks like, but when the rust infects it, it induces these pseudo flowers. right? So the rust actually stimulates the plant to grow and produce a structure that looks like a flower. You might say, well, why would the rust want to do that? Well, what happens is that this structure, this pseudo-flower, attracts insects, and the insects fertilise the rust. In much the same way as insects cross-pollinate flowers, this actually attracts the insects, they come down, they land on that, and they transfer the nectar, and they cross-fertilise the rust. So that's quite a remarkable evolutionary relationship between the rust, its host plant, and the insects that are attracted to actually fertilise the rust. Rust life cycles, rust pathogen life cycles, very complex. Okay, there are 5 basic life variations on the life cycles of rust. These depend on which spore states are present. So rust produce up to 5 different types of spores, and whether or not the rust needs 1 or 2 hosts to complete its full life cycle. Now I think you know, you would have all seen this picture. It's the life cycle of wheat stem rust. It could also be oat stem rust. This bit down here is where we see the part of the life cycle that we're most worried about on wheat, where the spores, the polycyclic nature of the epidemic is that the spores are produced and then they come back and they infect. At the end of the season, towards the end of the season, as the wheat plant is ripening, the rust produces these resting spores called teleospores. It's here where we get meiosis occurring, and this then leads on to the production of basidiospores, which infect the alternate host barberry, and I think we may be seeing some of that at some point during the next week, the infection on barberry. And it's on barberry where we see the sexual recombination occurring, where we see the actual fertilisation of the gametes to reconstitute what we call a dikaryon, and that dikaryon is manifested in the production of esiospores, which then go back to infect wheat. We'll be talking more about this throughout the course, but this is an example of a very complex life cycle of a rust. It involves 2 different hosts, and it involves all 5 spore states. So we would call this hetero-macrocyclic. Hetero meaning that it's heteroecious, it requires 2 different hosts on which it completes its life cycle, and macrocyclic meaning that it produces all of those 5 spore states. We have some rusts that are auteicious. These only require 1 host to complete their life cycle. I think, Zach, flax rust is an example of that, or bean rust?
No, sunflower rust.
Sunflower rust. And these, what's an example of an auteicious rust that produces all spore states? Can you think of one? I can't think of one anyway. Broadly speaking, they can be divided into 2 life cycles, one of which only needs 1 host plant to complete its life cycle on. And as Zach said, sunflower rust is an example of that, bean rust is an example of that. The others require 2 hosts. Wheat stem rust is an example of that. It needs wheat and barberry to complete its life cycle. And then sometimes we see the 4 spore states, 5 spore states produced. In other rusts it might only be 2. And that's how we come up with these different names here, depending on the host and depending on which spores are produced.